Hello and welcome to Cleveland Classic Cinema. Tonight's movie is 1943's Sherlock Holmes and the Secret Weapon, directed by Roy William Neill. Sherlock Holmes is one of my favorite literary and movie characters ever. There was just something about the unflappable confidence the man had in his abilities to deduct, well, everything, that absolutely delighted me. No matter who he went up against, no matter how smart they were, no matter how powerful they were, no matter how many men they had behind them, Holmes would outsmart them and come out on top. And the coolest thing is that he was based on a real person. In 1877, Arthur Conan Doyle, who was studying to become a doctor, went to work as an assistant for Dr. Joseph Bell, a lecturer at the medical school of the University of Edinburgh in Scotland. Bell always stressed the importance of observation and deduction in making diagnoses, and would demonstrate this by calling a random student or a total stranger up to the front of the class, and after observing him for a few moments, give everyone an amazingly detailed account of who they were, where they came from, and what they had done recently, and he was always correct. Doyle was amazed at this ability and based his character of Sherlock Holmes on Dr. Bell. The first published Sherlock Holmes story was 1887's A Study in Scarlet, followed 3 years later by The Sign of Four. His next Holmes novel, The Hound of the Baskervilles, was serialized in Strand magazine and started getting enormously popular with a series of short stories following this, beginning with A Scandal in Bohemia. The stories were always credited to Dr. John H. Watson, Holmes' only friend. Holmes himself always claimed that friendship interfered with his business of being the world's only consulting detective, and indeed often criticized Watson's retelling of his cases, remarking in The Copper Beeches that he had turned what should have been a course of lectures into a series of tales, a description of his work Watson took great umbrage at. One aspect of the history of Sherlock Holmes that was really dealt with, at least in the early incarnations of the films, was that he was addicted to both morphine and cocaine, at that time both legal substances. He turned to these drugs as a way to relieve his boredom between cases, regarding ennui as his greatest enemy. When he was into a case, however, the needle was tucked away in a locked desk drawer and he never touched it until the case was finished and the boredom crept in again. The first film to deal with his addiction head-on was 1976's The 7% Solution, directed by Herbert Ross, a wildly fanciful and entertaining story concerning Holmes' addiction getting the better of him. In desperation, Dr. Watson takes him to psychologist Sigmund Freud in an attempt to get to the bottom of his illness and acquire a cure. It's a great movie, very exciting and beautifully acted, with Nicole Williamson as Holmes, Robert Duvall as Dr. Watson, and Alan Arkin as Sigmund Freud. If you ever get the chance to see it, take it in. I guarantee you'll enjoy it. The first adaptations of Conan Doyle's stories were stage productions starring William Gillette as Holmes, beginning with 1899's Sherlock Holmes or The Strange Case of Miss Faulkner. It was Gillette who first portrayed Holmes as wearing a deerstalker's cap and smoking a meerschaum pipe. While Holmes did smoke and wear a deerstalker, his favorite pipe was a Briar Churchwarden, and he only wore a deerstalker when he traveled in the country. Being a gentleman, he usually wore a silk top hat. The meerschaum came from Gillette's preference for how it balanced when he held it between his teeth on the stage. Along with his gift for deduction, Holmes was also an expert swordsman, pro-level boxer, crack shot, an expert at martial arts, and an extremely adept at single stick, a martial art using an ash rod, although Holmes used his walking stick as a weapon more than once. Other than a Mutascope production entitled Sherlock Holmes Baffled, a Méliès-like 30-second film, Gillette was the first actor to portray Holmes on screen in 1916's Sherlock Holmes. I could spend a good 10 minutes or so running down all the actors who have portrayed Holmes in the hundreds of films made featuring the character, but I'm going to skip all that to get to the actor who portrays Holmes in tonight's film, Basil Rathbone. Basil Rathbone was born Philip St. John Basil Rathbone on June 13, 1892 in Johannesburg, South Africa. Just before the Boer War, Rathbone and his family fled to England when his father was accused of being a spy for the British. He attended the Repton School, where he proved to be more interested in sports. He excelled at fencing than his studies, but it was there he also discovered a love for acting through the theater program. After graduating, he worked as a clerk for an insurance company a year before abandoning that and joining a Shakespearean troupe based on Stratford-on-Avon, working his way up from bit parts to juvenile leads in just 2 years. In 1915, he fought for the British in World War I and was awarded the Military Cross for bravery. After leaving the Army, he acted on stage in both London and New York for the rest of the decade, then appeared in his first film, 1921's Innocent. He again rose through the ranks, going from a leading man to a villain, a role he absolutely excelled at, notably as Mr. Murdstone in 1935's David Copperfield, among many more. He put his fencing skills to good use in many films, including 1935's Captain Blood, 1938's The Adventures of Robin Hood, and 1940's The Mark of Zorro. He played many roles and was amazing in all of them, but many people feel he was absolutely born to play Sherlock Holmes. He looked just as the character was described and was incredibly adept at playing the brilliant detective. Watching his interaction with Nigel Bruce is an absolute joy, and seeing him in the various disguises he puts on in this movie is great. I remember being absolutely riveted watching his Sherlock Holmes movies as a kid, and I still get that same thrill from watching him now. After portraying Holmes both on the radio and in a series of films with shrinking budgets over a period of 7 years, he retired from the role feeling that he was being typecast. He returned to the stage and continued acting in films until his death from a heart attack on July 21st, 1967 in New York City. Nigel Bruce was born William Nigel Ernie Bruce on February 4th, 1895 in Ensenada, Baja California, Mexico. He appeared as an actor in 80 films, starting with an uncredited part in 1922's Flames of Passion, although that is disputed. He was typecast as a bumbling, confused English aristocrat in most of his films, but he didn't mind. He knew he had a limited acting range and was happy to play the same kind of role repeatedly. His family was part of English aristocracy, his brother being a baron. He was wounded during his service in World War I, being confined to a wheelchair due to his leg wound for a number of years. After his military service, he began acting and broke through with the role in Noel Coward's play, This Was a Man, on Broadway. After being hired by Fox to appear in films, he acted in 1934's Treasure Island and The Scarlet Pimpernel, 1935's She, and 1936's Charge of the Light Brigade. In 1939, he was paired with Basil Rathbone in The Hound of the Baskervilles and The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes, which made him internationally famous and cemented his career for the rest of his life. Nigel Bruce died of a heart attack on October 8, 1953 in Santa Monica, California. Dennis Hoey was born Samuel David Hyams on March 30, 1893 in London, England, United Kingdom. He started his career as a singer and moved into acting first on the stage in 1918 and later went into films, his first being 1927's Tiptoes. He appeared in 74 movies and TV shows during his career, but is best remembered for playing the perpetually mistaken Inspector Lestrade in the Sherlock Holmes films. Although it's pronounced Lestrade in the films, it's actually pronounced Lestrade. Unfortunately, there's not too much to tell about him, as his available bios are very brief. Dennis Hoey died on July 25, 1960 in Palm Beach, Florida. Sherlock Holmes and the Secret Weapon is one of the later Holmes films in the series. The first two were set in Victorian London, which I prefer since I think of Holmes as a Victorian character. But the rest were updated to the 1940s and featured Holmes and Watson fighting Nazis, as well as his perennial adversary, Professor Moriarty. Oddly, Moriarty always got killed at the end of the movies, but always returned in the next one, presumably after getting extensive plastic surgery, since he was played by George Zucco in 1939's The Adventures of, Lionel Atwill in tonight's movie, and Henry Daniell in 1945's The Woman in Green. I always enjoyed the moments when Holmes would inevitably be captured by Moriarty and then use his wits to extricate himself from the fix he was in, usually by playing to Moriarty's vanity. The main thing I dislike about the later films is that they always end with Holmes waxing poetic about Great Britain, and they always sounded a little stilted. although Rathbone always delivered them with conviction. This is a small complaint, however. The character of Sherlock Holmes is one that is always entertaining no matter what his surroundings. The BBC made an excellent series in the 1980s with Jeremy Brett as Sherlock and David Burke, and then Edward Hardwicke as Dr. Watson. And these were straight-on adaptations of Conan Doyle's stories set in Victorian times. In the new millennium, the BBC has returned to Sherlock Holmes with Sherlock, starring Benedict Cumberbatch as Holmes and Martin Freeman as Watson. Even though the two of them have been transported to present-day London, the series is brilliantly written and superbly acted and is well worth watching. I suggest you check it out. But right now, I think you should check out this movie. So right now, sit back, relax, and enjoy Sherlock Holmes and the Secret Weapon, right here on Cleveland Classic Cinema.